So recently I did a podcast for Fueling Greatness with Professor Asker Ukendrup.
Yeah.
And that one, we talked about nutritional periodization.
Mm-hmm.
Now, some people that will have listened to that podcast before this one will be going, hang on, is this the same thing or is it not? What's your thoughts?
It's related, but it's not necessarily the same thing, right? Because the nutritional periodization piece really revolves around what you're doing sort of throughout the year, treating it as a periodization part like your training. But it can also revolve within a day or a week when you're looking at maybe carb restricted training or periods where an athlete may need to lose weight versus times where you don't want them to. I think one of the cleanest examples of nutritional periodization is when you're working with a fighter, right? Because you can't have them eating the same thing and the same way all year long, especially once they hit fight camp, depending on how much weight you're trying to shift in order for them to make their next class. So, those are good examples of where we would apply this. So to be honest, the periodization piece, you look at it two ways. Either the periodization fits under nutrient timing or nutrient timing fits within the periodization piece, depending on what phase you're in and how you're manipulating it. And I think that where the nutritional periodization really winds up emphasizing the timing aspect is if you're training in a state of deficiency, right? We don't necessarily want to train in an optimal state all the time. It's kind of that notion of embrace the suck. There's times where suboptimal preparation. Now, you always want to compete in an optimal condition, right? That's a different story. But certain times at training, we may have to dig in a little bit and create these imperfect types of scenarios. And I would argue then what you do right after that to facilitate recovery and adaptation, that's where timing can be really important. Or if you're working with a fighter or an athlete who, and by the way, a fighter is an athlete. That just sounded really weird the way I said that. but I was like, oops, sorry. Now, if I said you're working with a bodybuilder or an athlete, that might be a different story. Now, when I look at it from that standpoint, though, when you're trying to fit that together, if you have somebody who's training multiple times a day, the periodization aspect becomes important, but timing winds up becoming critical to get you ready for the next bout, right? So, and I think that's where a lot of these conversations around timing forget that part of it, where you may have multiple sessions in a day or short recovery windows between sessions, or if you're working with an athlete playing in a tournament.
Yeah, no, exactly. That is exactly how it was presented and it's interpreted. And it's very interesting, as you've already said, when people talk about nutrient timing, historically, they're kind of really talking about protein timing, like you said, right? And it's very muscle hypertrophy sort of focused. It's about lifting and gaining and getting bigger and so on. Whereas when people talk about nutritional periodization, they're kind of talking about carbohydrates,
right?
Train low, train high, and also training the gut, that sort of thing. Now, it does not help, does it, that the scientists and the public are all speaking completely different languages, and maybe that's part of the problem. Is there's a lack of definitions on these things, but also there's a lack of consistency in the language that's used, even in the research, right? In the literature, you see seriously complicated, confused language being used.
Yeah, because people will actually, I'll give you an example where they'll confuse carb restricted training with fasted training. They're not necessarily one of the same. Carb restricted, you may still feed protein. You just don't feed carbohydrates. As a matter of fact, when you look at most of the studies that have shown a benefit to carb restricted training, it has not been fasted. It's when they fed protein. Where they didn't see the performance improvements was when they truly trained fasted, right? And so it wasn't until they started feeding protein to offset some of that you actually saw not only the mitochondrial adaptations, but the translation of performance. I think where we've done ourselves a disservice is I think there's too many people that have overgeneralized. Look, if you want to talk about protein timing, talk about protein timing. I have no problem with that. That is a legitimate conversation, but don't turn that into a global nutrient timing argument, because you're now missing all the other nutrients. You're focusing on one, and that's okay if you want to do that. Same thing even with nutritional periodization, right? Is funny enough, part of the reason why the focus is on carbohydrate there is, by and large, with your athletes, the one thing you don't really trade is their protein intake, right? Because that's kind of like your base filler. And then periodization kind of revolves around what else you pile on top of that and when, because we don't want to trade the anabolic aspect of what we're getting with protein from a recovery standpoint. So, again, I agree with you. Some of it is the terminology, but I think the catch is that's kind of funny is the problem isn't so much in the terminology, it's in our use of the terminology. It's the inconsistency or overgeneralization of what you're really talking about. And that's why I said, you want to talk about protein timing? Cool. Talk about protein timing. That is a legitimate, useful conversation. But don't make everybody think that that means that all nutrients are unimportant at certain times. It depends on what you're trying to do. For hypertrophy purposes, I don't know, maybe that is the big conversation. But for an immune system, neurological system, aerobic adaptation standpoint, recovery between sessions, I hate to say it, but there's other nutrients that start to matter too, besides just protein. And I'm pro-protein, right? I'm a protein fan, but it doesn't mean it's the only thing that matters.